The morning I found out my parents had forged my signature on a legal document, I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee and reading through a routine fraud alert that had landed in my work inbox overnight. That's what I do for a living. I find fraud. I've spent 11 years working as a forensic financial investigator, first for a federal agency, then for a private firm that gets hired by law offices, insurance companies, and estate attorneys when something doesn't smell right. I look at documents. I trace money. I find the thing that somebody buried and hope nobody would ever dig up. The irony of what happened that morning is something I'm still processing. The alert wasn't even from my job. It was from the trust management company that has been holding my late grandfather's estate since I was 19 years old. An automated notification. One of those things that gets sent out anytime there's an access attempt or a document filing on the account. I almost deleted it. Because I hadn't thought about that trust in a long time. It was just there. A thing in the background of my life that I knew existed but didn't think about because I couldn't touch it until I turned 35. That was the condition my grandfather set when he set it up. Nobody gets a dime until they're 35. And I was 34 years and 4 months old when that alert hit my inbox. 8 months away. That's how close I was. The alert said that a power of attorney document had been filed with the trust management company on my behalf. It said that a representative had been granted full authority to make decisions regarding the trust account, including the ability to redirect distributions, modify beneficiary terms, and request account freezes. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I read it again. I hadn't filed any power of attorney. I hadn't spoken to the trust company in over a year. I hadn't given anyone authority over anything. So I set down my coffee, opened my laptop, and started doing the thing I do every single day at work. I started investigating. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without understanding who my family is and how we got here. My grandfather, Earl, was a self-made man in the truest sense of that phrase. He grew up with nothing. Literally nothing. His father left when he was 6. His mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on half the time. Earl dropped out of school at 16, got a job at a machine shop, saved every dollar he made, bought a small piece of land in his late 20s, and spent the next 40 years building a real estate and agricultural business that, by the time he died, was worth just under $4 million. He was not a flashy man. He drove the same truck for 15 years. He ate lunch at the same diner every day and always tipped exactly 15%. He wore boots that he resold 3 times before he bought new ones. But he was sharp. Lord, was he sharp. He could read a person in 30 seconds. He always said that money reveals character, and that the best way to know who someone really is to watch how they behave when they think they're about to get some. He had 2 children. My mother, Diane, and my uncle Ray. And he watched both of them for a long time before he died. My mother married my father, Glenn, when she was 22. Glenn was charming. Glenn was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new best friends. He had big ideas and a big smile and a handshake that made people trust him immediately. What he didn't have was follow-through. Or financial discipline. Or, as it turned out, basic honesty. By the time I was 10, my parents had been through 2 bankruptcies. Not business bankruptcies. Personal ones. They lost a house. They borrowed money from my grandfather twice and never paid it back. My father cycled through businesses the way other people cycle through hobbies. Restaurants, car washes, a landscaping company, some kind of vending machine scheme that I still don't fully understand. My grandfather watched all of it without saying much. He helped when he could. He stayed quiet when he couldn't. But he was watching. My brother Derek is 4 years older than me. He got my father's charm and my mother's stubbornness, which is a combination that makes for a very compelling and very dangerous person. Derek was always the golden child. He got the parties and the new car and the college tuition paid in full without anyone asking questions. When Derek failed out of his first college, my parents blamed the school. When he got a DUI at 23, my father called in a favor and made it disappear. When Derek's first business failed, my parents co-signed a loan for his second one. I was the quiet one, the one who studied, the one who worked part-time jobs all through high school while Derek got an allowance. The one who got a partial scholarship and worked through college while my parents told me they were so proud of my independence. A word that I have since come to understand was their way of saying we're not paying for yours.
I didn't resent it then.
I was used to it. It was just how things were. What I didn't know until I was 19, 2 months after my grandfather's funeral, was that Earl had been watching everything. All of it. For years. The estate attorney's name was Margaret Cho. She had worked with my grandfather for almost 2 decades. When she called me 3 weeks after the funeral and asked me to come in alone, I thought maybe there was some small piece of property or a keepsake that he'd left me specifically. I drove to her office in my 2003 Honda Civic that had a broken air conditioner and a check engine light that had been on for so long I stopped seeing it. Margaret sat me down across from her big oak desk and slid a document across to me. It was the trust agreement. My name was on the cover page as sole beneficiary. She explained it quietly and carefully. My grandfather had set up the trust 8 years earlier, when I was 11. He had watched me, she said. He had seen what I was. He had also seen what my parents were and what Derek was, and he had made a decision. The trust would hold the majority of his liquid assets. Not the land, not the business. Those went to my Uncle Ray, who had proven himself capable of managing them. But the cash, the investments, the savings of a lifetime, $520,000 at the time of his death, went into the trust with my name on it. There were conditions. I couldn't touch it until 35. If I died before then, it would go to a list of charities he'd written out himself. My parents had no claim to it. Derek had no claim to it. The trust was managed by a third-party firm he'd specifically chosen because they had no existing relationship with my family. Margaret told me that my grandfather had left a letter with the trust documents. She handed it to me in a sealed envelope. I didn't open it until I got to my car. And then I sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes reading it over and over. I'm not going to share everything he wrote. Some of it is private in a way that still feels sacred to me. But I'll tell you the part that matters. Near the end of the letter, in his cramped, careful handwriting, he wrote, I have watched your parents take from everyone who loved them and give nothing back. I have watched your brother learn that lesson.
I have watched you decide not to.
You were 11 years old when I made this decision, and you were already more of a man than most I have known. Don't let them have this. You earned it by being exactly who you are. I sat in that parking lot and cried until I had nothing left. Then I drove home and didn't tell anyone. My parents found out about the trust approximately 6 weeks later.
I don't know how.
My best guess is that Uncle Ray mentioned something, or that one of the attorney's support staff was less discreet than they should have been. However it happened, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's trying to sound casual about something she's furious about. She asked me about the trust. Conversationally, like we were discussing the weather. I confirmed it existed. I didn't give details. I told her what the terms were, 35, sole beneficiary, no exceptions, and then I waited. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, well, your grandfather always did have a soft spot for you. I'm sure he meant well. That was the first flag, that sentence. Because my mother has never, in my entire life, said something like that about money without it being the opening move of something larger. Over the next few months, the behavior I'd grown up with kicked into a higher gear. More calls, more visits, more stories about how tight things were, how Derek's business was struggling, how the property taxes on the house had gone up, how my father's knee was bad, and he couldn't work as much. These weren't new conversations. My family had been having versions of them my entire life. But the frequency and the specificity increased in a way that now, looking back, I can map almost exactly to when they learned about the trust. I helped when I could, and when I believed the need was real. I bought my mother a new washer and dryer when hers broke. I helped my father with a car repair. Normal things. Reasonable things. But I never told them how much was in the trust, or exactly when I turned 35, or any detail that I didn't have to share. I'm not sure when they figured out the timeline, but at some point they did. Back to that morning. Back to the alert on my laptop. I pulled up the trust company's portal and logged in. The power of attorney document had been filed 4 days earlier. It listed my name as the principal. It listed my father, Glenn, as the agent with full authority. It had a notary stamp on it. It had what appeared to be my signature. I knew immediately that it was forged. I knew because I had not signed it. I also knew because I've spent 11 years looking at forged documents, and there are tells that you learn to see so quickly it becomes almost unconscious. The signature on that document was close. It was genuinely close. But it had a slight hesitation in the loop of my last name that I never have because I've been signing my name the same way since I was 12, and muscle memory doesn't lie. I took a screenshot. I saved the document. I forwarded the alert to my personal backup email. Then I picked up my phone and called the trust company's fraud line, which I knew the number for because I had worked a case involving a similar firm 2 years earlier and had saved their contact in my phone. The representative I spoke to was professional and thorough. I explained that I had received an unauthorized POA notification and that I had not signed any such document. She put a temporary administrative hold on any changes to the account while an internal review was initiated. She also told me that the document had been filed by a person presenting themselves as my authorized representative and that the filing had been accompanied by a notarized copy of what appeared to be my ID. I asked her to preserve everything. Every record of the filing, every piece of documentation that had been submitted, every timestamp, every access log. I told her I was a forensic financial investigator and that I would be following up with formal requests through legal channels. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll escalate this to our compliance team right now." "Good," I said. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long moment. My parents had forged my signature on a legal document, filed it with a financial institution, with a fake notarization, to gain control over my money before I could claim it. They had committed federal fraud, and they had done it to someone who finds federal fraud for a living. Here's what a less experienced person might do in that moment. They might call their parents. They might confront them. They might post about it somewhere. They might tell their friends. They might cry or yell or fall apart. I did none of those things. I got up, got dressed, and went to my home office. I have a filing system there that I use for personal documents the same way I use one at work. Every important document in my life is scanned, backed up in 2 cloud locations, and cross-referenced. My original trust documents. The letter from my grandfather. Every communication I've had with the trust company over the years. Every financial statement. I pulled all of it. I read through everything. I looked for gaps, for anything I might have missed, for any angle I hadn't considered. Then I started a new file. I labeled it with the date and the word I use at work when something has been confirmed as intentional misconduct. I labeled it case. Over the next 3 weeks, I did things in a specific order. First, I retained an attorney. Not just any attorney. I called someone I had worked with on a case 2 years earlier, an estate and fraud attorney named Victor Osei, who had a reputation for being absolutely methodical and absolutely relentless. I explained the situation. He agreed to take it. We met twice in the first week. Second, I requested the full document package from the trust company through formal legal channels. Victor filed the request. We received the original power of attorney submission, the notarization records, the ID copies that had been submitted, and the access logs showing exactly who had filed what and when. Third, I had the signature analyzed. I have a contact at a document examination lab, a woman I've worked with probably 30 times over my career. I sent her a certified copy of the POA signature alongside multiple confirmed genuine signatures of mine from various legal documents over the past decade. Her report came back in 8 days. The POA signature was not mine. High confidence. She documented the specific points of divergence in a 12-page report that I printed out and added to the file. Fourth, I started looking at the notary. This is where it got interesting. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a woman named Patricia Hale. She was a licensed notary in our state. Her commission was current. On paper, everything looked legitimate. But a notary is supposed to verify the identity of the person signing in front of them. They're supposed to watch you sign. They're supposed to check your ID in person. I hadn't been anywhere near a notary. I hadn't been anywhere near Patricia Hale, which meant either she had notarized a document without witnessing the signing, which is notary fraud, or someone had presented a fake ID in my name and she had been fooled, which was still a serious problem, but a different kind. I looked up Patricia Hale.
She was a notary, yes.
She worked part-time out of a small insurance office. She was also, I found through about 45 minutes of basic records research, the next-door neighbor of my father's oldest friend, a man named Carl, who had known my father for 30 years. There it was. I added it to the file. My mother called me during the third week. She sounded normal. She asked how work was. She mentioned that she and my dad were thinking about visiting, maybe next month. She asked if I was eating well. I told her things were good. I asked about my dad's knee. I asked if Derek was doing okay. I did not mention the trust. I did not mention the POA. I did not mention anything. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and felt something I don't have a perfect word for. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more focused than anger. It was the feeling I get at work when I've confirmed that a fraud is real, and I know exactly where the evidence is, and I'm just waiting for the right moment to move. I had been here before, just never with my own family. About 6 weeks into what I was now privately thinking of as the investigation, I got a call from Derek. Derek and I have a complicated relationship. That's the cleanest way to put it. I love my brother in the way you love someone you grew up with and share blood with and have specific memories with that nobody else in the world has. I also have no illusions about who he is. He called on a Sunday afternoon, and he started the conversation the way he always does when he wants something, by being warm and funny and nostalgic, telling a story about something we did when we were kids, getting me laughing, pulling me in. Then he said, "Hey, so, Mom and Dad were telling me about some issues with Grandpa's trust. Some kind of administrative thing. They said you might need to sort some paperwork out." I said, "Oh yeah?" He said, "Yeah, I think they're just trying to help you manage it, you know. Make sure everything's set up right before you turn 35. You know how Dad gets with financial stuff." I said, "I appreciate that. I've got it handled."
He paused.
Then he said, "So you're not going to work with them on this?" And I said, very calmly, "Derek, I've got everything handled. You don't need to worry about it." The warmth in his voice shifted slightly, just slightly, in a way that told me he'd been asked to make this call. He wasn't acting on his own. He was running an errand. I added that call to the file. My 35th birthday was 8 weeks away when Victor called me with an update that changed the shape of everything. He had been in contact with the trust company's legal team. They had completed their internal review. Based on the documentation they had received from us and their own analysis, they had concluded that the power of attorney filing appeared to be fraudulent. They had voided it. The account was secure. But Victor had also done something I hadn't specifically asked him to do, which is one of the reasons I value him. He had quietly run searches on my family's financial situation. What he found was not a surprise, exactly. But the scale of it was. My father had 3 outstanding judgments against him. 2 from business creditors. 1 from a private individual who had loaned him money. The combined total was a little over $280,000. My brother's business had defaulted on an SBA loan 8 months earlier. The government was pursuing collection. My parents' house had a second mortgage on it that was 90 days delinquent. They were not having a rough patch. They were drowning. And my 35th birthday, the day I would receive $520,000, was 8 weeks away. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about what he had said in that letter. I thought about the 40 years he had spent building something, resoling his boots, tipping exactly 15% at the same diner every day. And then I thought about Patricia Hale, the notary. And I thought about something Victor had mentioned almost offhandedly, that the person who had filed the document in person at the trust company had signed a visitor log. I asked Victor to get a copy of that log. He got it. The signature on the visitor log was my father's. Here is something that people who don't work in fraud investigation sometimes don't understand. The goal is not just to stop the bad thing. The goal is to build a record that is so complete and so airtight that when the moment of accountability comes, there is no wiggle room. No alternative explanation. No walking it back. I was 11 weeks into building that record when my mother called and asked me to come home for my birthday. She made it sound warm. She said the family wanted to celebrate. She said she'd make my grandfather's favorite recipe, a pot roast with root vegetables that had been in his family for generations. She said it had been too long since we'd all been together. I said I'd come. Victor strongly advised against it. I told him I'd been watching this family my entire life. I knew how to be in that room. What neither of us knew was what they were planning for that gathering. I drove home on a Friday evening in early spring. The drive is about 2.5 hours. I spent most of it on the phone with my document examiner, going over a few final points of her report, and then with a friend of mine who works for the state attorney general's office in the financial crimes division. Not an official call, just a conversation between two professionals who know each other. The house looked the same as it always did. The same faded paint. The same truck in the driveway that I remembered from childhood, now even older. The same feeling of arriving at a place that holds equal parts warmth and grief. My mother hugged me at the door. My father shook my hand and clapped me on the shoulder and told me I looked good. Derek was already there, sitting on the couch with a beer, and he stood up and we did the shoulder bump thing that serves as our version of an embrace. And then I saw the other people in the room. There were 4 of them I hadn't expected. My parents' friends, who I've known my whole life. And, sitting at the dining room table with a briefcase at his feet, a man I didn't recognize. My mother introduced him as a family financial advisor. She said they'd asked him to come explain some options for managing the trust distribution when it came through. She made it sound completely reasonable. She made it sound like a gift, like they were just trying to help me make smart decisions. I looked at the man. He was in his early 50s. Nice suit. Practiced smile. He slid a business card across the table toward me. I picked it up and looked at it. And then I did something that I want to be very clear about. I did not react. I kept my face completely neutral. I set the card down and I said, "Sure, let's hear what you have to say." Because what I had just seen on that business card was something that took me about 4 seconds to process. The firm's name. I knew that firm. I had seen it in documents 2 weeks earlier when I was doing financial research on my family. This man's firm was listed as the registered agent for one of my father's business entities. He was not an independent advisor. He was connected to my father. This was not a birthday dinner. This was an ambush. I'll tell you what they had planned because I learned it later in full detail, but let me first tell you what that evening looked like from the outside. The man, whose name was Robert, gave what I can only describe as a polished presentation. He talked about trust management. He talked about tax implications. He talked about investment strategies. He used words like fiduciary and liquidity events and diversified portfolios. The family friends nodded along like they understood what he was saying. What he was building toward, slowly and carefully, was a proposal. The proposal was that I should voluntarily transfer the trust funds, upon distribution, into a managed account at his firm. He had documents ready. He had a contract ready. He explained the fees, which were substantial, and the structure, which would have given him discretionary authority to make investment decisions on my behalf. My parents watched me the whole time with expressions I know how to read. Hope. Anxiety. The specific look my mother gets when she wants something and isn't sure she's going to get it. When Robert finished talking, he slid the contract across the table toward me. I looked at it. I flipped through the pages slowly. I took my time. Then I looked up and asked Robert how long he had known my father. He blinked. He said they had worked together on some business matters in the past. I asked him to be more specific. The room got very quiet. My father said, "What does that have to do with anything, son?" And I said very calmly, "Glenn, I'd prefer if you didn't call me that right now." I had never, not once in my life, called my father by his first name. The look on his face when I did it was something I had imagined, but had never seen before. It was the look of a man who has just realized the thing he thought was in the bag is not in the bag. I stood up. I picked up the contract. I picked up Robert's business card. I said, "I'm going to hold on to these. I have some questions I'd like to answer before we continue this conversation." My mother said, "Honey, we're just trying to help." I said, "I know. I appreciate that. I need a few days." And I left. I drove halfway home and then pulled over into a gas station parking lot because my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the effort of staying calm in that room, when what I had wanted to do was put everything on the table right there in front of the family friends and the fake advisor, and the pot roast that smelled exactly like my grandfather's house. I called Victor. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They didn't give up after the POA failed. They built a second approach." "Exactly," I said. He said, "Are you ready to move forward?" I said yes. "Birthday's in 3 weeks," he said. "I know," I said. "We file Monday," he said. I said yes. I sat in that parking lot for another 20 minutes. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the machine shop and the boots and the letter in the sealed envelope. I thought about what he had built and why he had built it and who he had built it for. Then I pulled back onto the highway and drove home. What happened on Monday morning is what I want to tell you about because it is the part that, when I explain it to people who ask me about this story, makes them go quiet in a particular way. Victor filed a formal fraud complaint with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division. The complaint included the forged power of attorney document, my document examiner's report concluding the signature was not mine, the trust company's records of the filing, the visitor log with my father's signature, the records connecting Patricia Hale to my father's associate Carl, and Robert's business card alongside the documentation linking his firm to my father's business entities. The complaint was thorough. It was complete. It left nothing in the air. Victor also sent a certified letter to my parents' home address and to Derek's business address. The letter informed them that a fraud complaint had been filed, that legal proceedings were underway, and that any further attempts to interfere with the trust account or contact the trust management company would be considered additional criminal acts. He also filed a motion to have the notary's commission reviewed, which he sent to the state licensing board. I didn't call my parents. I didn't email them. I didn't send them a message of any kind. I found out later that my mother called Derek within an hour of receiving the letter, and that Derek called my father, and that my father called Robert, and that Robert stopped returning calls by the end of the day. The trust distributed on my 35th birthday, which fell on a Tuesday in April. I was sitting at my kitchen table, which is where all of this began, when the confirmation came through on my phone. The full amount, plus 11 years of managed growth, which had brought the total to just over $612,000. I sat there for a minute. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to Victor. The second was to my document examiner, who had been with me since the beginning of this and who had sent me a text that morning that just said, "Thinking about you today." I didn't call my family. But I need to tell you about what happened 3 weeks after the distribution, because that's where the public piece of this story falls. My Uncle Ray, my grandfather's son, the one who had gotten the land and the business, had been watching everything unfold from a distance. Ray and I have always had a different relationship than I have with my parents. He's a quiet man, like his father. He doesn't say much, but he sees things. Ray had been planning a memorial gathering at the family property to mark what would have been my grandfather's 90th birthday. It was a tradition he'd started a few years after Earl died. Family came. Old friends came. People who had worked for my grandfather came. It was usually a quiet afternoon with food and stories and the kind of warmth that my grandfather himself would have appreciated. My parents always came. Derek always came. I had been going every year since the tradition started. This year, Ray called me 2 weeks before and asked if I was coming. I told him I needed to think about it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are some things I've been meaning to say. To everyone. I think this year would be a good time to say them." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Your grandfather told me some things before he died. About why he set up the trust the way he did. About what he saw in your mother and your father. I've been quiet about it for a long time. But after what happened this year, I don't want to be quiet anymore." I told him I'd be there. The gathering was on a Saturday afternoon in late May. About 30 people. The old farmhouse, the long table set up outside, the food that people brought. The smell of cut grass and early summer. My parents arrived 20 minutes after I did. My mother saw me and smiled the smile she uses when she's not sure what's happening. My father shook Ray's hand and then looked at me the way he had been looking at me since I'd called him Glenn at the dinner table. Carefully, trying to take a reading. Derek was the last to arrive. He hugged Ray. He clapped a few old family friends on the shoulder. He found a beer. He came over to where I was standing and said, "Good to see you." And I said the same, and we both knew we were speaking in code. About an hour into the afternoon, Ray stood up. He's not a man who makes speeches. He's not comfortable with that. But he stood up with a glass of iced tea, and he said he wanted to say a few words about his father and the kind of man Earl had been, and the things Earl had cared about. He talked about the machine shop. He talked about the boots. He talked about the diner and the tip. He talked about a man who had watched everything and said very little and made his judgments through action rather than words. Then he said, "My father made a decision about his estate that I want to talk about today, because some of what's happened this year has made me realize that not everyone understands why he made it." My mother's expression shifted.
Barely.
But I saw it. Ray talked about my grandfather's observations of the family. He was direct but not cruel. He talked about the loans that had never been repaid, the businesses that had failed, the patterns he had watched over decades. He said his father had not made his trust decision out of cruelty or favoritism, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of character and responsibility. He said, "Earl told me, 2 months before he died, that he had watched every one of his grandchildren. He said one of them showed him something different. He said that one of them had already decided who they were going to be, and that he wanted to make sure that person had the foundation to build on." The people around those tables were quiet. Some of them were old enough to have known my grandfather personally. Some of them were watching my parents. My mother was holding her paper cup very carefully, the way she holds things when she's trying not to show a reaction. Ray said, "I also want to be direct about something. There were attempts this year to interfere with the trust that my father established. Legal actions were filed. Complaints were made. Proceedings are ongoing." He looked around the table. Not dramatically, just factually. "I want people here to know that those attempts failed. And I want people here to know that my father was right about the people he was right about, and right about the person he put his faith in."
He sat down.
"I'm not going to tell you that my mother cried or that my father made a scene or that Derek stormed off. It wasn't like that. It was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it worse. My mother finished her food. She talked to a few people. She left early, before dessert, saying she had a headache. My father followed her. Derek stayed another hour, and at one point he came and sat next to me, and we looked out at the fields for a while without saying anything. Then he said, 'You really did it, didn't you?' I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, 'You built the whole case. The whole thing. You had everything.'
I didn't respond to that.
He said, 'Dad could go to jail.' I said, 'That depends on how the AG's office proceeds. I don't control that.' He was quiet. Then he said, 'Grandpa really did always like you best.' I looked at him. I said, 'It wasn't about being liked, Derek.' He nodded slowly. He finished his beer. He said, 'I know,' in a voice that was very tired and maybe more honest than anything I'd heard from him in years. 'Here is where things stand now. The Attorney General's investigation is ongoing. I'm told by Victor that the notary has already cooperated extensively in exchange for reduced penalties. Patricia Hale confirmed that she had been asked to notarize a document without the principal present, that she had been told it was a routine family matter, and that she had done so without verifying my identity in person. She named my father as the person who made that request. Robert, the financial advisor, is facing a separate licensing inquiry. The connection between his firm and my father's business entities has been documented. He is no longer practicing. My parents retained an attorney. That attorney contacted Victor, and there were some early conversations that went nowhere. The matter is in the hands of the state now, and I don't have control over the timeline or the outcome. I don't know what will happen to them. Truly. I don't know if there will be criminal charges or plea agreements, or what the final shape of the consequences will look like. What I know is that the record exists. It's complete. It's documented. It's in the hands of people whose job is to do something about it. My relationship with my parents is, for now, at a standstill. I haven't spoken to my mother since the gathering. I've exchanged 2 brief emails with my father through our respective attorneys. It's possible that at some point there's a conversation to be had. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm not in a hurry. Derek and I have texted a handful of times. Nothing deep. Weather, mostly. His business is struggling badly. I don't know what I'm going to do about that, if anything. That's a question I'm leaving open for now. My grandfather's letter is in a fireproof safe in my home office. I've read it probably 30 times since he died. Maybe more. There's a line near the beginning that I keep coming back to, something I skipped over the first few times because I was too focused on the end of it. He wrote, "The people who take shortcuts with their integrity always believe they've found a smarter way. They haven't. They've just moved the cost to somewhere they can't see it yet." I've thought about that a lot this year. My parents believed they were being smart. They believed they had found a workaround. They had watched me my whole life, this quiet, responsible, unremarkable person who kept his head down and did his work, and they had calculated that I was manageable, that I could be navigated around, that they could get to the money before I could, or lock me out of it, or talk me into handing it over through a fake financial advisor at a birthday dinner. What they didn't calculate was that the quiet, responsible, unremarkable person had spent 11 years learning exactly how to find exactly what they had done. They forgot, or maybe they never knew, that still waters are not shallow waters. They forgot who I am. But my grandfather never did. And at the end of all of this, sitting in that farmhouse at those long tables with the smell of cut grass and early summer around me, I understood something about the man who had left me that letter in a sealed envelope when I was 19 years old. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me a test, a long, slow test of exactly the kind of person I would become over 16 years. And when that test came, it came exactly the way he might have predicted it would, and I handled it exactly the way he might have hoped. That's the thing that makes me feel something I can only describe as peace. Not the money. Not the vindication. Not watching Robert pack up his briefcase and disappear. Not the AG investigation or the notary's testimony or the look on my father's face when I called him Glenn. The peace comes from knowing that my grandfather read me right when I was 11 years old. That he saw something worth protecting. That after everything, every forged signature, every fake advisor, every careful manipulation, every phone call, every attempt to get what was never theirs, he was still right. He was right about all of it. And so was I.